My son died 5 years ago in a strange accident. Every year I transferred $50,000 to his wife so she could take care of my grandson. But one morning at breakfast, he whispered in my ear, "Grandpa, stop sending Mom money. Better follow her to the casino tonight. You won't believe it." The contrast between the grieving widow and her real life made me uncover the truth. What I discovered won't go unpunished. She'll beg on her knees, facing the consequences of her betrayal. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is in your region right now. My name is Harley Mitchell. I'm 67 years old and I live in Reno, Nevada. For 25 years, I served as a district court judge before retiring 3 years ago. I always believed in justice, in the law, in doing what's right. I also believed that family was sacred. That belief cost me everything. 5 years ago, my son Chris died in a car accident. His Honda Accord skidded off an icy mountain road and plunged into a canyon. The police called it a tragic accident. Wrong place, wrong time, slippery conditions. My boy was 32 years old. He left behind a wife, Danielle, and a 5-year-old son, Lucas. I did what any father would do. I helped. Danielle was young, devastated with a child to raise. She moved into my 3-story house on Pinewood Drive with Lucas. I sent her $50,000 every year to make sure my grandson had everything he needed. It seemed like the right thing to do, honoring Chris's memory by taking care of his family. Danielle was always beautiful. Even in grief, she had this fragile elegance that made people want to protect her. Dark hair, pale skin, those wide eyes that could fill with tears at a moment's notice. Chris had been so proud when he married her. "Dad, she's perfect," he'd told me at their wedding. I'd believed him then, but over the past 3 years, something changed. Danielle started disappearing in the evenings, leaving Lucas with me. "I'm meeting Jennifer for dinner," she'd say, or "I have a therapy session." Always an excuse, always delivered with that same sad smile, as if I should pity her for having to explain herself. Lucas would sit at the kitchen table doing homework, his small face too serious for a 10-year-old. Sometimes I'd catch him watching his mother leave, something unreadable in his expression. When I asked if everything was okay, he'd just nod and go back to his math problems. The morning of March 12th started like any other. I was making scrambled eggs while Danielle checked her phone at the kitchen table. Lucas sat beside her, pushing cereal around his bowl. The kid barely ate anymore. "Lucas, honey, finish your breakfast," Danielle said absently, her thumbs flying across her screen. She was texting someone, a small smile playing at her lips. I brought the eggs to the table and sat down. "Big plans today, Danielle?" "Just errands," she replied, not looking up. "Might go shopping later." "Shopping?" I kept my tone neutral. $50,000 a year, and she needed more shopping trips. Danielle excused herself to refill her coffee. The moment she left the table, Lucas leaned toward me. His eyes, Chris's eyes, were suddenly intense. "Grandpa," he whispered urgently, "stop sending Mom money." I blinked. "What?" "Follow her to the casino tonight. You won't believe what you'll see." "Casino?" Before I could respond, Danielle returned, and Lucas snapped back to his cereal, like nothing had happened. My grandson had just dropped a grenade in my lap, and I was sitting there with the pin in my hand. The rest of breakfast passed in a fog. I watched Danielle text and smile. I watched Lucas avoid his mother's eyes. When they both left, Danielle to her errands, Lucas to school, I sat alone in my kitchen and thought about my grandson's words. A casino. What the hell was a 10-year-old doing, knowing about casinos? That evening, Danielle came downstairs wearing a tight black dress and heels. "I'm meeting Jennifer for drinks," she announced, grabbing her purse. "Have fun," I said from my armchair, not bothering to look up from my book. The moment her car pulled out of the driveway, I was on my feet. I'd spent 25 years on the bench learning to read liars. Something in Lucas's whisper had the ring of truth. I followed her in my sedan, keeping 3 cars back. She didn't head toward any restaurant. Instead, she drove straight downtown to the Silver Legacy Casino, that massive complex with the neon lights visible from miles away. I watched her park and walk inside, those heels clicking against the pavement with practiced confidence. This was not the walk of a grieving widow going to meet a friend. I gave her 5 minutes, then followed. The casino floor was a chaos of slot machines, flashing lights, and desperate hope. I spotted Danielle at a blackjack table, chips stacked in front of her. I stayed back, half hidden behind a row of slot machines, and watched. She played for 2 hours. I watched her lose hand after hand. When she finally walked away from the table, she'd dropped $3,400. I felt sick. That was my money. Money meant for Lucas's education, his clothes, his future. But then something worse happened. A man approached her at the bar, early 40s, wearing jeans and a work shirt with grease stains on the sleeves. Danielle's face lit up when she saw him. They didn't shake hands or exchange polite greetings. They kissed. And not the way you kiss a friend. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and took photos. They moved to a private VIP area, arms around each other. I couldn't follow them there without being obvious. That's when I remembered Marcus Torino, the casino's manager. I'd presided over his nephew's custody case 8 years ago, ruled in his favor. He owed me. 20 minutes later, I was in Marcus's office watching security footage. "How long?" I asked him. Marcus pulled up the records, his face sympathetic. 3 years, Judge. She comes in 3 times a week, like clockwork. Always meets the same guy. Who is he? Scott Wells. Owns an auto repair shop on South Virginia Street. My blood ran cold, an auto mechanic. Chris had died in a car accident. I drove home in a daze. Everything I thought I knew was crumbling. When I walked in, Lucas was sitting on the stairs in his pajamas, waiting for me. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked quietly. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He handed me a folded piece of paper. "I found this yesterday. I wrote it down from Mom's phone." I unfolded it, in Lucas's careful handwriting. "Grandpa, that man is the mechanic who fixed Dad's car before the accident. I saw his photo in Mom's phone. They were texting before Dad died." The world stopped spinning. My living room, my grandson, everything went silent except for the roaring in my ears. I read the note again, and again. Before Dad died. I looked at Lucas, at his serious face, at the burden he'd been carrying. "How long have you known?" 3 years, he whispered. "I was scared to tell you." I pulled my grandson into my arms and held him while my mind raced. Chris's accident, the insurance payout, Danielle's behavior, the mechanic, the timeline. My son hadn't died in an accident. He'd been murdered. I didn't sleep that night. After Lucas went to bed, I went down to my study and pulled out the file I'd kept from Chris's accident. I'd made the police give me copies of everything 5 years ago, unable to accept that my son was just gone. The accident report was thorough. December 14th, 2020. Chris had been driving home from work on Highway 431, the mountain route. Witnesses said his car accelerated into a turn instead of slowing down, then went straight through the guardrail. The drop was 200 feet into Mount Rose Canyon. He died on impact. The investigation concluded brake failure, possibly due to ice affecting the brake lines. Chris was ruled an unfortunate victim of winter conditions. Case closed, except now I knew better. I flipped through the maintenance records. There it was, buried in the paperwork. Chris's last service appointment had been at Wells Auto Repair, 3 days before he died. The mechanic listed on the work order, Scott Wells. I grabbed my phone and called Kevin Brown, a private investigator I'd worked with during a fraud case years ago. He answered on the third ring. "Judge Mitchell, it's 3 in the morning. I need you to find everything about Scott Wells. Auto mechanic, owns a shop on South Virginia, and I need to know when he started seeing my daughter-in-law." There was a pause. "How far back should I look?" 5 years, I heard him exhale. "I'll get started at dawn." The next morning, Danielle came down to breakfast like nothing had happened. She poured coffee, made toast, chatted about her plans for the day. I sat across from her and studied the woman I'd welcomed into my home. How had I missed this? How had I been so blind? "Harley, you look tired," she said, concern creasing her forehead. "Are you feeling all right?" "Fine," I replied. "Just thinking about Chris." Her face did that thing it always did. A flicker of sadness, a downturn of her lips. Perfect grief, performed on cue. I miss him too. Every day. Liar, I thought, but I just nodded and sipped my coffee. I remembered the last time I'd seen Chris alive. It was a Sunday afternoon in early December, We'd met at my favorite chess club. He'd been learning the game, wanted to get better. He'd been happy that day, talking about a promotion at work, about taking Danielle and Lucas to Disneyland in the spring. "Dad, I'm lucky," he'd said, moving his bishop. "I've got a great wife, a great kid, a great life." Sometimes I can't believe how well everything turned out. I'd beaten him in 23 moves. He'd laughed and promised to practice more. 3 days later, he was dead. Had Danielle been planning it even then? Had she sat across from my son at breakfast, kissing him goodbye, knowing he'd never come home? "Harley?" Danielle's voice pulled me back to the present. "You're staring." "Sorry, lost in thought." She smiled that sad smile. "I understand. Some days the grief just hits harder, doesn't it?" I wanted to flip the table. Instead, I excused myself and went upstairs. 3 days later, Kevin Brown came to my house with a manila folder. We sat in my study with the door locked. "You're not going to like this," he said. "Tell me anyway." He opened the folder. Inside were photos, phone records, witness statements. Scott Wells and Danielle Mitchell started their affair 6 months before Chris died. There's a waitress at the Desert Inn Motel who remembers them. She saw them together in October 2019, multiple times. 6 months before, while Chris was alive, working, playing with Lucas, trusting his wife. "There's more," Kevin continued. "The life insurance payout on Chris was $250,000. Danielle collected it within 3 months of his death. And here's something interesting. She convinced Chris to increase his policy amount just 2 months before he died. Told him they should think about Lucas's future." I stared at the evidence spread across my desk. My daughter-in-law and her lover had killed my son for insurance money. Then they'd let me fund their lifestyle for 5 years with my annual $50,000. I'd been paying my son's murderers. The rage that filled me was cold and precise. In all my years as a judge, I'd seen evil. But this was different. This was personal. "What do you want me to do with this?" Kevin asked. I looked at him. "I need more. I need proof they tampered with Chris's car. I need them to admit what they did. Judge, 5 years is a long time. Physical evidence will be hard. Then we create a situation where they incriminate themselves." Kevin studied me for a long moment. "You want to set a trap. I want justice. If you're not comfortable with that, I understand." He closed the folder. "What do you need?" That's when I started planning. I thought about every case I'd presided over, every legal manipulation I'd seen, every way clever people tried to hide their crimes. The law was a weapon if you knew how to use it, and I'd spent 25 years learning exactly that. I couldn't go to the police yet. 5 years had passed. The case was closed. Without new evidence, concrete, undeniable evidence, they'd never reopen it. But if Danielle and Scott thought their comfortable life was threatened, they'd panic, and panicked people make mistakes. That night, Lucas and I played chess in the living room. Danielle was out. "Another friend meeting," she'd said. Lucas moved his knight, then looked up at me. "Are you going to do something, Grandpa?" "Yes." "Good." He moved his queen. "Mom shouldn't get away with it." I studied my grandson. 10 years old, and he understood justice better than most adults. Chris would have been proud. "Lucas, this might get difficult. You might have to be very brave." "I want to help." "You already have, more than you know." After he went to bed, I sat in my study and wrote out my strategy, step by step, piece by piece, like a chess game. I'd give Danielle and Scott exactly what they feared most: the loss of money, the threat of exposure, the pressure that would make them crack. I'd spent 25 years putting criminals behind bars. Now it was time to put the law to personal use. For Chris, for Lucas, for justice. My phone buzzed. A text from Kevin. "Found the mechanic who worked with Wells in 2020. He's willing to talk. Says Wells acted strange around the Honda Accord, wouldn't let anyone else touch it." I smiled in the darkness of my study. The pieces were falling into place. Danielle came home after midnight, humming to herself. I heard her heels on the hardwood floor, heard her lock the door, heard her climb the stairs. She was happy, satisfied, safe in her lies, not for much longer. I opened my laptop and started drafting legal documents. A new will, a living trust, financial restructuring, all the tools I needed to spring my trap. By the time dawn broke over Reno, I had my strategy mapped out. Danielle and Scott had killed my son and thought they'd gotten away with it. They were about to learn that you can't outrun justice, especially when justice knows every legal trick in the book. I was going to destroy them, methodically, legally, completely, and I was going to make them confess to what they'd done. The game had begun. 2 days after my night in the study, I walked into the Washoe County Courthouse Records Department. The building was familiar territory. I'd spent decades walking these halls, presiding over cases in the courtrooms upstairs. Now I was here as a civilian, searching for answers about my own son's death. The clerk recognized me. "Judge Mitchell, haven't seen you since your retirement. What brings you in?" "Just need to review some old accident reports," I said, keeping my tone casual. "Personal matter." She didn't ask questions. 20 minutes later, I sat in a small research room with a file box in front of me. Chris's accident report was thinner than I remembered. I'd read it 5 years ago through a haze of grief, accepting the police conclusion because I couldn't bear to question it. Wrong place, wrong time, tragic accident. Now I read it with a judge's eye, looking for what I'd missed. The accident occurred on Highway 431, the mountain route toward Lake Tahoe, December 14th, around 6 in the evening. Witnesses reported Chris's Honda Accord accelerating into a curve instead of braking. The car went through the guardrail at high speed and dropped 200 feet into Mount Rose Canyon. The investigating officer concluded brake failure, likely due to ice affecting the brake fluid lines, but buried in the maintenance section was a detail that now made my blood run cold. 3 days before his death, Chris had taken his car to Wells Auto Repair for routine service. The work order was signed by Scott Wells himself. I sat back in my chair, the implications washing over me. Scott had access to Chris's car. Scott had the knowledge to sabotage it. Scott was sleeping with Chris's wife before the accident even happened. My hands shook as I photographed every page of the report with my phone. That afternoon, I met Kevin Brown at a coffee shop downtown. He slid a manila envelope across the table. "You're not going to like this," he said, echoing his words from our first meeting. Inside were phone records, motel receipts, and a witness statement from a woman named Patricia Gomez. She worked as a housekeeper at the Desert Inn Motel on the eastern edge of Reno. "Ms. Gomez remembers them clearly," Kevin explained. "October through December of 2019. Danielle and Scott checked in every Thursday afternoon, room 217, always paid cash. She remembers because Danielle tipped well and was always cheerful, acted like they were on some kind of romantic getaway. October through December, 6 months before Chris died. While my son was working to provide for his family, planning that Disney trip, his wife was spending Thursday afternoons in a cheap motel with a mechanic." "There's more," Kevin continued. "I talked to one of Scott's former employees, guy named Danny Reeves, worked at the shop until 2 years ago. He remembers Chris's Honda Accord coming in that December. Said Scott insisted on doing the brake work himself, wouldn't let anyone else touch it. Reeves thought it was weird because Scott usually delegated the routine stuff." I stared at the photograph of the motel. Cheap siding, neon sign, the kind of place you go when you don't want to be seen. "Can Reeves testify to this?" "He's willing to talk, if it comes to that. But, Judge, it's been 5 years. The physical evidence is probably gone, even if you go to the police. They'll tell me it's circumstantial," I finished. "Suspicious, but not enough for a murder charge," Kevin nodded. "You need them to confess, or you need to find physical evidence of tampering." I thought about that for a long moment. Then I asked, "What happened to Chris's car after the accident?" "Towed to impound, held for 3 months during the investigation, then moved to a salvage yard when the case closed. It might still be there. Most yards keep wreckage for years in case of insurance disputes." That evening, I watched Danielle from my study window as she prepared to go out. She'd changed into a short red dress, applied careful makeup, spritzed perfume in the hallway. When she called out that she was meeting Sarah for dinner, I just nodded. Lucas was doing homework at the kitchen table. I joined him, watching as he worked through algebra problems. "She's going to see him, isn't she?" Lucas said quietly, not looking up from his notebook. "Probably. Do you believe me about what I saw on her phone?" I put my hand on his shoulder. "I believe you completely. and I'm going to make sure she pays for what she did to your father." He looked up at me then, and I saw tears in his eyes. "I miss Dad." "I know, buddy. I miss him too." After Lucas went to bed, I sat in the darkened living room and thought about the man my son had been. Chris was kind, too kind maybe. He'd believed the best in people. He'd trusted his wife completely, never suspected she could betray him. That trust had killed him. I heard Danielle's car pull into the driveway after midnight. She came in humming, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. Through the window, I could see her checking her reflection in the hallway mirror, smoothing her dress, smiling at what she saw. She looked happy, satisfied, like a woman who'd just spent the evening with her lover, secure in the knowledge that no one suspected anything. I watched her climb the stairs to her bedroom, the bedroom in my house, where she lived rent-free on my generosity while planning. What? Her future with Scott? Had she already been dreaming of Chris's death when they checked into that motel room? Had the insurance money been part of the plan from the start? The next morning I drove to Peterson's salvage yard on the industrial edge of Reno. The owner, a grizzled man named Frank, remembered me from a case I'd overseen years ago involving stolen auto parts. "Judge Mitchell, what brings you out here?" "I need to see my son's car, the Honda Accord from the Mount Rose Canyon accident, December 2020. Frank's expression softened. "I remember that one. Still have it in the back lot. Follow me." We walked through rows of crushed vehicles until we reached a fenced area where older wrecks were stored. Chris's Honda was there, crumpled and rust-stained, covered in 5 years of dust and weather. The front end was completely destroyed from the impact, but the undercarriage was exposed where the tow truck had hauled it up from the canyon. I knelt beside it, looking at the brake lines. I wasn't a mechanic, but I knew what I was looking for. Any sign of tampering, any evidence Scott had done more than routine maintenance. "See something?" Frank asked. "I don't know. Would it be possible to have a forensic mechanic examine this?" "For you?" "Absolutely. I know a guy who does accident reconstruction for insurance companies. Want me to set it up?" "Please." As I stood up, I noticed something wedged under the passenger seat, a phone charger cable, the kind Chris always kept in his car. Danielle must have sat in that passenger seat 1,000 times, never knowing it would be her husband's coffin. Driving home, I felt the rage building again, cold, focused rage that settled in my chest like ice. They'd killed my son. They'd stolen 5 years of my money. They were living freely while Chris was in the ground. But not for much longer. I was done being the grieving father, the generous grandfather, the trusting fool. They wanted to play games? Fine. I'd spent 25 years on the bench watching criminals try to outsmart the law. I knew every trick, every loophole, every pressure point, and I was going to use all of it to destroy them. The next morning, I called Jonathan Stewart's office and made an appointment. Jonathan was an estate planning attorney I'd known professionally for years. We'd crossed paths in court occasionally. Always professionally, never personally. That distance was important now. I needed an attorney who would give me objective advice, not someone who might let friendship cloud their judgment. His office was on the 5th floor of a building on North Sierra Street. Modern, efficient, expensive? Jonathan met me in his conference room, a lean man in his 50s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes. "Judge Mitchell," he said, shaking my hand. "It's good to see you. What can I do for you?" "I need to discuss my estate," I said. "Specifically, I want to make some changes to my will and possibly set up a trust." We spent the next hour discussing options. I was careful with my words, never revealing the real reason for my visit. Jonathan laid out various strategies for protecting assets, transferring property, and ensuring my wishes would be carried out. At one point, he mentioned something that made my ears prick up. "If you're concerned about someone contesting the will," he said, "the best approach is often to create a situation where they reveal their true intentions before the assets are actually distributed. Financial pressure tends to expose people's real priorities." I nodded slowly. "What kind of pressure?" "Well, if someone believes they're about to lose access to money they've been counting on, they often act impulsively, make demands, show their hand. It's not pleasant, but it does clarify things." "Financial pressure. Make them show their hand." I felt the pieces clicking into place. "Let's say, hypothetically," I began, Someone wanted to change their beneficiaries without alerting the current beneficiaries right away. Could that be done? Of course. A will is a private document until death. You could revise it tomorrow, and no one would know unless you chose to tell them. Similarly, transferring property into a revocable living trust can be done quietly. And if I wanted to make people think I'd already made those changes, even if I hadn't yet? Jonathan looked at me carefully. That would be inadvisable from a legal standpoint, Judge. Though I suppose if you left certain documents where someone might find them, and if those documents happened to be drafts or preliminary versions, he trailed off meaningfully. I smiled. Hypothetically speaking, of course. Of course. I left his office with a strategy forming in my mind. The legal approach would be part of it, real changes to my estate that would protect Lucas's inheritance. But the psychological approach, the trap I was building that would require something more. Over the next few days, I became a different kind of investigator. I watched Danielle the way I'd once watched defendants in my courtroom, noting every tell, every inconsistency, every moment when her mask slipped. She was good at playing the grieving widow. When Lucas's teacher called about a parent-teacher conference, Danielle's voice took on that breathy, sad quality. It's been so hard for him since his father passed. I do my best, but always the victim, always struggling, always deserving sympathy. But when she thought no one was watching, her eyes went cold. She'd check her phone constantly, smiling at messages. She'd count money in her purse, cash, probably from her casino trips. Once I heard her on the phone in her bedroom. 2 more weeks, baby. Just 2 more weeks until he sends the check. Then we can go to that resort you wanted. Baby. She called him baby while living in her dead husband's father's house. I started documenting everything. When she went out, I noted the times. When she claimed to be one place but her car was parked somewhere else, I photographed it. I was building a case the way I'd built hundreds of cases from the bench, methodically, carefully, leaving no room for doubt. Kevin Brown proved invaluable. He set up surveillance, tracked Scott's movements, confirmed that Danielle was still meeting him 3 times a week. They had a routine now, polished by 5 years of practice. Tuesday and Thursday evenings at the casino, followed by Scott's apartment downtown. Saturday afternoons at a different motel, changing locations every few weeks. They're cautious but not paranoid, Kevin reported. They think they got away with it clean. No reason to suspect anyone's watching. Good, I said. Let's keep it that way. I met with a notary, Gerald Fisher, to draft the actual legal documents I'd need. Real documents this time, not drafts. I was transferring my house, worth $680,000, into a revocable living trust with Lucas as the beneficiary and me as the trustee until he turned 25. I was also establishing an educational fund in Lucas's name, seeded with $200,000 from my retirement savings. These weren't empty threats or psychological games. These were real protections, ensuring that if anything happened to me, Danielle couldn't touch what was meant for my grandson. But I also had Gerald prepare something else, a draft will, deliberately left incomplete, with notes in the margins about excluding Danielle entirely. This draft I would leave where she could find it. Not the real documents, which would be safely filed with Jonathan's office, but convincing-looking paperwork that would make her panic. "You're sure about this approach?" Gerald asked as he notarized the legitimate documents. "I'm sure. It seems like you're trying to provoke a reaction." "I am." He studied me for a moment. "Judge, I've known you for 15 years. I've never seen you like this." "My son was murdered," I said quietly, "and the people who killed him have been living off my money for 5 years. So yes, I'm different now." Gerald nodded slowly and finished the paperwork without further comment. That evening I sat with Lucas and explained what was going to happen, or at least as much as a 10-year-old needed to know. "I'm making some changes," I told him. "Legal things that will protect you and make sure you're taken care of. Your mother might get upset. She might say or do things that seem scary, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Lucas looked at me with those serious eyes. "Are you going to make her confess?" "Smart kid. Too smart, maybe. I'm going to make sure justice is served." "Good. She should pay for what she did to Dad." I hugged him then, this brave little boy who'd been carrying the weight of his mother's sins for 3 years. "You're just like your father. He'd be proud of you." The stage was set. The documents were ready. The surveillance was in place. Now I just needed to light the fuse and watch everything explode. I thought about Chris, about the last conversation we'd had, about his excitement for the future, about how he'd trusted the wrong person. I couldn't bring him back, but I could make sure his killers faced consequences. Justice had been my life's work. Now it was personal. I had one advantage they didn't know about: patience. I could wait for the perfect moment. I could watch them squirm. I could tighten the noose gradually, so gradually they wouldn't realize they were caught until it was too late. And when they finally understood what was happening, when they realized the old man they'd dismissed as a convenient bank account was actually a predator who'd been studying them all along, that's when I'd spring the final trap. They thought they'd gotten away with murder. They were about to learn that you never really get away with anything. You just haven't been caught yet. And their time had finally come. A week passed before I made my move. I needed everything in place. The real documents filed safely with Jonathan, the fake drafts ready to be discovered, and Kevin's surveillance equipment installed and tested. Patience, I reminded myself. Rush this, and they'd see through it. The confrontation happened on a Saturday morning. I called Danielle into my study, where I'd laid out financial statements on my desk. Lucas was at a friend's house. I'd arranged that deliberately. What was about to happen, he didn't need to witness. Danielle knocked and entered, wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweater. She looked relaxed, comfortable. That was about to change. "Sit down," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "We need to talk about finances." She sat, crossing her legs, that familiar concerned expression settling on her face. "Is everything okay, Harley? You look stressed." Stressed, as if I were the problem. "I've been thinking about Lucas's future," I began, "about how best to secure it. He's 10 now, and college is only 8 years away." "That's very thoughtful of you." She smiled, that sad widow smile. "Chris would have appreciated, which is why I've decided to make some changes." I slid a paper across the desk. "This year's payment of $50,000 will be the last one." The smile froze on her face. "What?" "I'm establishing an educational trust for Lucas. All of my assets will be directed there. My savings, my retirement accounts, everything. He'll have access when he turns 25. She stared at the paper without touching it. I watched the calculation happening behind her eyes, watched her try to process what this meant. "But, Harley, I need that money. For Lucas's expenses. For the house. For—" "The house is already provided," I interrupted. "You live here rent-free. As for other expenses, you're an adult with a nursing degree. I'm sure you can find employment." "I haven't worked in years." Her voice rose, the careful mask slipping. "I've been raising Lucas. I've been—" "Going to the casino 3 times a week?" I let the words hang in the air. Her face went pale. Actually pale, like someone had drained the blood right out of her cheeks. "I don't— How did you—" "I know a lot of things, Danielle. More than you'd like." I leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice level, almost casual. "The point is, the arrangement we've had is ending. You'll receive this year's payment as promised. After that, you're on your own." She stood up, her hands trembling. "This is ridiculous. Chris would have wanted—" "Chris is dead." My voice could have cut glass. "And I've decided how to handle my own money. The documents are already signed. The decision is final." I watched her face cycle through emotions. Shock, disbelief, anger, calculation. This was the woman who'd killed my son, standing in my study, trying to manipulate me one more time. The urge to tell her I knew everything was almost overwhelming, but that would ruin the trap. So I just looked at her blandly, like a judge who'd made his ruling and wouldn't be swayed by emotional appeals. "You can't do this," she said, but her voice wavered. "I already have. You're welcome to continue living here until you find other arrangements. But the money stops at the end of this year." She turned and walked out without another word. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, heard her bedroom door slam. Then 10 minutes later, I heard her car start in the driveway. I pulled out my phone and texted Kevin, "She's on the move. Be ready." His response came immediately. "Equipment is active. I'm tracking." The surveillance equipment Kevin had installed in Danielle's car was, technically speaking, illegal. I knew that, but it wouldn't be used in court. It was purely for my information to know when they'd incriminate themselves in a way that could be legally recorded. I spent the afternoon playing chess online, forcing myself to stay calm, to wait. Lucas came home around 4, and we made dinner together. Spaghetti, his favorite. He didn't ask about his mother's absence. Smart kid knew when to stay quiet. Danielle came home after midnight. I heard her stumble slightly coming up the front steps. She'd been drinking, or maybe just crying. Either way, her comfortable world was cracking. The next morning, Kevin called me. "You need to hear this." I drove to his office, a small second-floor space above a dry cleaner. He had a recording ready, headphones already plugged in. "This was last night," he explained. "She went straight to Scott Wells's auto shop. They talked in his office for 2 hours." I put on the headphones and pressed play. Danielle's voice, panicked and raw. "The old man cut me off, Scott. This year's payment is the last one. He's putting everything into some trust for Lucas." Scott's voice, deeper, annoyed. "Calm down. What exactly did he say?" "He's changing his will, transferring the house. Everything goes to Lucas when he turns 25. I get nothing." A long pause. Then Scott. "The house is worth what? 600 and something thousand?" 680,000. "But it doesn't matter if I can't access it." Another pause. Scott's voice changed, got darker. "When he dies, everything goes to Lucas. And Lucas is a minor, which means his guardian controls it until he's 25. I'm his guardian. Exactly. So really, we just need the old man out of the way sooner rather than later." My hands tightened on the desk. Kevin was watching my face. Danielle's voice, quieter now. "You're talking about Scott. He's 67. He could live another 20 years. Scott laughed. It was a cold sound, calculated. "Remember how we solved the Chris problem? Old people have accidents too. Heart attacks, falls downstairs. These things happen." There was a long silence on the recording. Then Danielle, almost whispering, "We said we'd never do that again. We said Chris was..." "Was what? The last one? Come on, baby. You want to go back to working double shifts at some hospital? Or do you want to live in that nice house with all that nice money?" The recording ended. I sat there, staring at Kevin's desk, processing what I'd just heard. They'd admitted talking about solving the Chris problem. They'd just discussed killing me. "That's not enough," I said finally. "They're careful. They didn't explicitly confess to murdering Chris, just implied it." Kevin nodded. "I know, but they're rattled now. Keep the pressure on and they'll slip. They always do." I thought about that drive home. They were planning to kill me. My own daughter-in-law and her mechanic boyfriend were discussing my murder like it was a business decision. The fury that filled me was ice-cold and absolute. Over the next few days, I finalized the real legal documents with Jonathan and Gerald Fisher, the notary. Everything was legitimate, properly filed, completely legal. My house was transferred to a living trust with Lucas as beneficiary. My will was revised to exclude Danielle entirely. Every asset I had was protected. Then I created the bait. I took the draft documents, the incomplete ones with margin notes and corrections, and left them spread across the kitchen table one morning when I knew Danielle would find them. I went out, ostensibly to my chess club, but really just drove around for 2 hours to give her time. When I came home, the papers had been moved. Not much, just enough to show someone had looked at them, and Danielle was in her room with the door closed. I could hear her voice, muffled, talking urgently on the phone. The trap was closing. 2 days later, Kevin called me with an urgency I'd never heard in his voice before. "They're meeting at the Sunset Inn Motel tonight. I've got equipment ready to install in the room, but I need your authorization. This is going to cost you $8,500, and it's definitely illegal surveillance." "Do it," I said without hesitation. "I need them to confess clearly, on tape. Admissible evidence or not, I need to know exactly what they did." That evening, while Danielle told me she was meeting her grief support group, I sat in my study with my phone on the desk, waiting. Kevin had sent me a link to the audio feed. I could hear everything in real time. The sound of a door opening. Footsteps. Then Danielle's voice, breaking with sobs. "He transferred everything to Lucas. I found the papers, Scott. The house, his savings, everything. It's all in some irrevocable trust. I get nothing when he dies." "Irrevocable?" Scott's voice was sharp. Are you sure? I saw the documents. They're signed, notarized, filed with the court. We're screwed. There was a crash, something thrown against a wall. Scott cursing, then silence. We need to move faster, Scott finally said. Do it this week, before he changes anything else. How? Danielle's voice was small, frightened. He's watching me now, I can feel it. He knows something. He doesn't know anything. He's just being careful with his money. Old people do that? Scott's voice turned calculating. The stairs. You said he comes down every morning around 6 for coffee. Those stairs are steep, and he's 67. One push, one fall, and it's all over. My blood ran cold. They were planning the specific method, the specific time. I can't, Danielle started. You can't? You couldn't do it with Chris either, remember? You just had to convince him to take the car to my shop. I did the actual work. His voice softened, turned manipulative. Baby, you don't have to touch him. I'll handle it. Just like before. Like before, Danielle repeated quietly. I told you the brakes would fail on that mountain road, didn't I? I promised it would look like an accident. And it did. Nobody ever suspected anything. You got your $250,000 from the insurance, plus all that money from the old man. We've been living good for 5 years. There it was. The confession. Clear, detailed, specific. Danielle was crying now. I can't believe we're talking about doing this again. Killing Harley, Chris's father. Chris's father who just cut you out of $680,000, Scott snapped. You want to be poor again? Working night shifts? Living in some apartment? Or do you want that house, that money, that life? A long pause. Then Danielle, voice hardening. What do we do? I'll come by Thursday morning early. Tell him I'm there to look at your car. Some engine trouble. Get him downstairs, distracted. I'll wait at the top of the stairs. One push. He tumbles down, breaks his neck. You call 911, crying, saying your father-in-law fell. Tragic accident. And if it doesn't work? Then we try something else. But it'll work, just like it worked with Chris. I sat in my study, hands shaking, listening to them plan my murder with the same casual efficiency they'd used to plan my son's. The recording continued, Danielle asking about details, Scott reassuring her, both of them getting comfortable with the idea. Finally, I'd heard enough. I ended the call and sat in the darkness, processing everything. They'd confessed. Clearly, specifically, admissibly confessed to killing Chris by sabotaging his brakes. They'd discussed killing me in detail. I had everything I needed. The next morning, I called Detective Veronica Hayes. I'd known Veronica for 15 years. She'd been a homicide detective handling cases that came through my courtroom. She was thorough, ethical, and wouldn't dismiss evidence just because it came from a judge instead of an official investigation. We met at a coffee shop downtown. I brought everything, the recordings, the photographs, Kevin's surveillance reports, the witness statement from the motel housekeeper, the maintenance records showing Scott had worked on Chris's car 3 days before his death. Veronica listened to the motel recording with her eyes closed, her expression getting harder with each passing minute. When it ended, she was quiet for a long moment. Harley, she finally said, this is enough for arrest warrants, but I need to do this right. If I move too fast, their lawyers will tear it apart. Give me 3 days to build the official case. I'll reopen Chris's death investigation, interview witnesses, get the forensics team to examine what's left of his car. 3 days, I agreed. But Veronica, they're planning to kill me Thursday morning. Her eyes snapped to mine. Then you don't go near those stairs. Better yet, go stay somewhere else, a hotel. I'm not running from them. Harley, I want to be here when you arrest them. I want to see their faces when they realize what's happening. She studied me, then nodded slowly. All right, but you keep your doors locked, and you don't let either of them in your house alone. 3 days crawled past. I kept my distance from Danielle, spent time with Lucas, acted like nothing had changed. Meanwhile, Veronica was working behind the scenes. She interviewed Danny Reeves, Scott's former employee, who confirmed Scott had personally handled Chris's brake work and hadn't let anyone else touch the car. She got a forensic mechanic to examine the wreckage at Peterson's salvage yard. On the 3rd day, Veronica called. We found evidence of deliberate tampering with the brake lines, specific cuts designed to fail under pressure. The forensic mechanic says whoever did it Knew exactly what they were doing. It's not proof Scott did it, but combined with everything else, it's enough. It's enough. We're making the arrest tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. That night, I barely slept. Tomorrow, 5 years of lies would end. Tomorrow, justice would finally begin. The next morning, I was in my study when I heard the cars pull up. Multiple vehicles, police cruisers, an unmarked detective car. I went to the window and watched Veronica and 3 uniformed officers walk to my front door. Danielle answered. I heard her voice, confused. Detective Hayes, what's going on? Danielle Mitchell, you're under arrest for the murder of Chris Mitchell and conspiracy to commit the murder of Harley Mitchell. The sound she made wasn't quite a scream, more like all the air being punched out of her lungs. I walked downstairs slowly, deliberately. Danielle was in handcuffs, her face the color of ash. She saw me standing there, and something broke in her expression. Harley, tell them this is crazy. Tell them. I know what you did, I said quietly. I know everything. The officers led her to their cruiser. I watched through the window as she twisted in the back seat, trying to look back at the house, her mouth moving soundlessly. Across town, Scott Wells was being arrested at his auto shop. Veronica called me 20 minutes later with an update. He's denying everything. Danielle, though, she paused. Harley, she's asking to talk to you. No. She's saying she'll confess if you'll just listen to her story. She wants to explain. There's nothing to explain. She killed my son for money. That's all I need to know. At the police station, they played the motel recording for both suspects. That's when Danielle broke completely. Veronica called me to come down as a witness. When I arrived at the interrogation room, Danielle was sobbing, mascara running down her face in black rivers. The moment she saw me through the one-way glass, she dropped to her knees on the floor. Harley, please, I'm sorry. It was Scott. He made me. He manipulated me. I loved Chris. I swear I loved him. I looked at her through the glass. No sympathy. No anger. Just cold assessment. Veronica was beside me. Do you want to go in there? Yes? She led me into the interrogation room. Danielle was still on her knees, hands cuffed behind her, face blotchy and destroyed. She looked up at me with desperate eyes. Harley, please. You have to believe me. Scott convinced me that Chris was going to leave me, that I needed security. He said the insurance would take care of Lucas and me. I didn't want Chris to die. You killed my son for money, I said. My voice was level, final. You planned his murder, you enabled it, and you benefited from it. Then you took my money for 5 years while planning to kill me too. There's nothing you can say that changes any of that. But I'm Lucas's mother. What's going to happen to him? Lucas will be fine. He'll be with someone who actually loves him. You can't take my son away from me. I looked down at her, this woman on her knees, and felt absolutely nothing. No satisfaction, no triumph, just empty certainty. You killed his father, I said quietly. Now justice will take its course. I turned and walked out. Behind me, Danielle's screams echoed through the police station. Harley, please, don't do this. Harley. The door closed, cutting off the sound. Veronica walked me to the lobby. That was harsh, she said. It was honest. I looked at her. What happens now? The prosecutor will file formal charges. First-degree murder for Chris. Conspiracy to commit murder for the plot against you. Insurance fraud. With the recordings and the forensic evidence, this case is solid. Good. Harley, she hesitated. Are you okay? I thought about that. Was I okay? My son was still dead. My daughter-in-law had betrayed everything. My grandson would grow up knowing his mother was a murderer. No, I admitted, but I will be, eventually. I drove home to find Lucas sitting on the front porch, a neighbor with him. The boy looked at me with those serious eyes that were so much like Chris's. Grandpa? Where's Mom? I sat down beside him, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the weight lifting. Not gone, but lighter. Your mom is going to be away for a while, I said, but you're going to stay with me. Is that okay? Lucas looked at me for a long moment. Then he leaned against my shoulder. Yeah, that's okay. Justice wasn't finished yet. There would be a trial, testimonies, judgments, but the hardest part, the hunt, the trap, the confrontation, was over. I'd done what I set out to do. My son's killers were in custody. My grandson was safe, It wasn't victory. It was just what had to be done. The trial began 6 weeks after the arrests. The Washoe County Courthouse, the same building where I'd spent 25 years on the bench, now became the stage for my son's justice. The prosecution charged them with first-degree murder of Chris Mitchell, conspiracy to commit murder against me, and insurance fraud. The evidence was overwhelming. The recordings, the forensic analysis of Chris's car, witness testimony from Scott's former employee, the motel housekeeper who'd seen them together before Chris died. But Danielle's lawyers weren't giving up without a fight. 2 weeks into the proceedings, the lead prosecutor, a sharp woman named Margaret Chen, called me to her office. Danielle's attorney approached us with a plea deal. She's willing to testify against Scott in exchange for a reduced sentence. I sat across from Margaret, my jaw tight. What kind of reduction? They're asking for 18 years instead of life. She'd claimed Scott manipulated her, that she was a victim too. She wasn't a victim. My voice was flat. The phone records show she was the one who convinced Chris to take his car to Scott's shop. She was the one who increased his life insurance 2 months before he died. She was an active participant. Margaret nodded. That's exactly what I told her attorney. The evidence doesn't support the poor, manipulated wife narrative. She knew what she was doing every step of the way. So what did you tell them? I rejected the deal. We're going to trial on all counts. Good. I wanted a jury to hear everything. I wanted 12 people to understand exactly what these two had done. The day I testified arrived too quickly, and not quickly enough. I'd spent weeks preparing, going over my statement with Margaret, but nothing quite prepared me for walking into that courtroom as a witness instead of a judge. The courtroom was packed. News crews lined the hallway outside. This wasn't just another case. It was a judge's son murdered by his own wife. The media had been circling like vultures since the arrests. I took the stand, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Looking out at the courtroom, I saw Danielle at the defense table, her face pale and drawn. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Scott sat at a separate table, his expression sullen and defiant. Margaret stood and approached the witness stand. Mr. Mitchell, can you tell the court about your relationship with the defendant, Danielle Mitchell? She's my daughter-in-law, was married to my son Chris until his death 5 years ago. And after Chris's death, what was your relationship with Danielle? I supported her financially. I sent her $50,000 annually to help with my grandson's expenses. She lived in my home rent-free. For how long did this arrangement continue? 5 years, until I discovered she was using the money to gamble at casinos and support an affair with Scott Wells. Danielle's attorney objected, but the judge allowed it. The facts were already in evidence. Margaret walked me through everything, finding Danielle at the casino, discovering her relationship with Scott, learning about their affair that predated Chris's death. I spoke calmly, stating facts the way I'd learned to do from the bench. No emotion, just truth. Mr. Mitchell, when did you first suspect your son's death wasn't an accident? When my grandson told me the man his mother was seeing was the same mechanic who'd serviced Chris's car 3 days before the accident. A murmur went through the courtroom. The jury leaned forward. Margaret introduced the recordings into evidence. The courtroom listened in absolute silence as Danielle and Scott's voices filled the room, discussing how they'd solved the Chris problem, planning my death, confessing to sabotaging the brakes. I watched the jury's faces, shock, disgust, anger. Several of them glanced at Danielle with expressions that told me everything I needed to know about which way they were leaning. When Scott's voice on the recording said, "Just like it worked with Chris," one juror actually gasped. Danielle's attorney tried to salvage something during cross-examination. "Mr. Mitchell, isn't it true you secretly recorded my client without her knowledge or consent?" "I hired a private investigator who recorded conversations in which your client confessed to murder and planned another one." "Yes. Isn't that illegal surveillance?" "The surveillance itself may have been obtained through questionable means, but it led to a legitimate police investigation that uncovered substantial physical evidence. The forensic analysis of my son's car stands independent of any recording." The attorney tried several more angles, but I'd spent too many years in courtrooms to be rattled by cross-examination. I answered every question calmly, precisely, giving them nothing to work with. When I stepped down, I felt lighter. I'd said what needed to be said. The truth was out there now, on the record, undeniable. The prosecution's case continued to build. Danny Reeves, Scott's former employee, testified that he'd seen Scott personally working on Chris's Honda Accord and refusing to let anyone help. He said it was a special job, that he needed to handle it himself. I thought it was weird because brake work isn't complicated. We all did that kind of work. Then came the forensic expert, a mechanic who specialized in accident reconstruction. He'd examined what remained of Chris's car at the salvage yard. The brake lines showed evidence of deliberate tampering, he testified, using photographs projected on screens throughout the courtroom. Specifically, there were partial cuts in the brake fluid lines, positioned in a way that would allow the brakes to function normally at first, but fail under sustained pressure, such as going down a mountain road. Could these cuts have occurred naturally? Margaret asked. Absolutely not. The cuts were precise, made with a sharp tool, positioned exactly where they'd cause maximum damage, while initially appearing normal. This required knowledge of automotive systems and deliberate intent. The defense attorneys tried to argue the damage could have occurred during the crash or in the 5 years since, but the expert was unshakable. The cut patterns are distinctive and inconsistent with accident damage. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. I watched Scott during this testimony. His face had gone from defiant to worried. He kept whispering urgently to his attorney, who just shook his head. The evidence was crushing them piece by piece, fact by fact. There was no way out, no legal trick that would save them. The trap I'd built was perfect, and they were caught in it completely. Danielle's attorney made one last desperate attempt. During a recess, Margaret told me they'd approached her again. They're offering full cooperation now. Danielle will plead guilty to manslaughter and conspiracy. 18 years. No, I said immediately. Harley, you're not the prosecutor. This isn't technically your decision. Then let me be clear. If you take that deal, I'll speak to every news outlet in Nevada about how the prosecution went soft on a woman who murdered her husband for money and planned to kill her father-in-law. Your office will be crucified. Margaret studied me for a long moment. You know I can't be influenced by threats. That's not a threat. It's information you should consider when making your decision. I kept my voice level. She doesn't get to escape justice because she's willing to betray her co-conspirator. They both deserve the maximum penalty. Margaret nodded slowly. The deal is already off the table. I just wanted to see your reaction. Despite everything, I almost smiled. She was testing me, making sure I wasn't letting emotion override judgment. Fair enough. The evidence speaks for itself, I said. Let the jury decide. The hardest day of the trial came 3 weeks into the proceedings. Lucas was scheduled to testify. The judge had approved special accommodations. Lucas would testify via video conference from a private room, with only a child psychologist and a court officer present. The defense attorneys could cross-examine, but through the video feed, making it less intimidating for a 10-year-old. I sat in the courtroom, hands clasped tightly together, as the screen flickered to life. Lucas appeared wearing a button-down shirt I'd helped him pick out that morning. He looked so small on that screen, so young to be carrying this burden. The prosecutor questioning him was gentle, taking her time. Lucas, can you tell us about your mother's behavior in the months before your grandfather discovered her at the casino? Lucas's voice was quiet but clear. She went out a lot at night. She said she was visiting friends or going to therapy, but she was gone for hours. Sometimes she wouldn't come home until really late. Did this worry you? Yeah. I didn't like being alone. Did you ever see your mother with Scott Wells? Lucas nodded. I saw pictures of him on her phone. About 3 years ago, I picked up her phone to play a game, and there were messages from him. Lots of messages. What did these messages say? Things like, miss you and can't wait to see you. They used heart emojis. Lucas's face showed confusion, pain. I didn't understand why Mom was texting a man who wasn't Dad. Danielle started crying at the defense table. Her attorney put a hand on her arm, but I could see it was useless. The jury was watching her with cold eyes now. The prosecutor continued gently. Lucas, do you remember your father? Yes, Lucas's voice broke. He was really nice. He used to play catch with me in the backyard. He taught me how to ride my bike. He always made pancakes on Saturday mornings with chocolate chips in them. Several jurors were wiping their eyes now. The image of Chris, this kind father, teaching his son to ride a bike, was impossible to ignore. Did your father love your mother? Yes. He always kissed her goodbye in the morning. He brought her flowers sometimes, just because. He said she was beautiful. Lucas's face crumpled. He didn't deserve what happened to him. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Lucas, do you know why you're testifying today? Because Mom and that man killed my dad. His voice was stronger now, clearer. They sabotaged his car so he'd crash. They did it for money? Danielle's attorney immediately objected. Your Honor, the witness is a child. He's repeating what he's been told. Overruled, the judge said firmly. The witness may continue. Lucas looked directly at the camera. I'm not just repeating things. I know Mom was seeing that man before Dad died. I know she got insurance money. I know she's been lying for 5 years. His voice shook, but didn't break. My dad was good, and they killed him. That's what happened. The defense attorney's cross-examination was cautious, clearly aware that attacking a child witness would backfire spectacularly. Lucas, isn't it possible you misunderstood what you saw on your mother's phone? No. The messages were clear. Couldn't your mother have had innocent friendships? They weren't friends, Lucas interrupted. Friends don't send messages like that. Friends don't meet in motels. The attorney tried a few more angles, but Lucas was unshakable. For a 10-year-old, he was remarkably composed, answering every question with painful honesty. When his testimony ended, I felt a surge of pride mixed with sadness. My grandson shouldn't have had to do this. He should have been playing video games and worrying about school projects, not testifying about his mother's crimes. But he'd done it. He'd told the truth, and the jury had heard him. The defense tried to recover. They called character witnesses for Danielle, people who testified she'd been a good mother, a devoted wife before Chris's death. But none of it could overcome the recordings, the forensic evidence, or Lucas's testimony. Scott's defense was simpler. Deny everything. He claimed the recordings were taken out of context, that he'd never tampered with Chris's car, that Danielle was trying to frame him to reduce her own sentence. But then the prosecution called Danny Reeves again, Scott's former employee. Did Scott Wells ever say anything to you about the Honda Accord repair? Reeves shifted uncomfortably. 2 days before the accident, I asked Scott if the Honda was ready. He was still working on it in Bay 3. He told me, this has to look like an accident. No traces. The courtroom erupted. Scott's attorney was objecting, demanding to know why this hadn't been disclosed earlier. Reeves explained he hadn't understood the significance at the time. He'd thought Scott was talking about repair work, making sure it looked professional. But after Mr. Mitchell died, Reeves continued, and I heard it was brake failure, I started wondering. Then when Scott got arrested, I realized what he'd meant. He was talking about making the murder look like an accident. Scott was shouting now, standing at his table. He's lying! This is fabricated testimony! The judge hammered his gavel. Mr. Wells, sit down, or you'll be removed from this courtroom. Scott sat, but his face was red with rage. His careful denial strategy had just collapsed. The prosecution rested. The defense had nothing left. You could feel the weight of the evidence settling over the courtroom like a heavy blanket, suffocating any chance of acquittal. Closing arguments were powerful on both sides, but the prosecutor had the easier job. She simply recounted the evidence. The affair beginning before Chris's death. The insurance policy increase, the brake tampering, the 5 years of deception, the planning of my murder, the confessions on tape. These defendants killed Christopher Mitchell in cold blood for money, she told the jury. Then they planned to kill his father the same way. They showed no remorse, no hesitation. They discussed murder like it was a business transaction. The evidence is overwhelming. Justice demands a guilty verdict on all counts. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the 4 persons stood and read the verdict. On the count of first-degree murder of Christopher Mitchell, we find the defendant, Danielle Mitchell, guilty. Danielle collapsed in her chair, sobbing. On the count of first-degree murder of Christopher Mitchell, we find the defendant, Scott Wells, guilty. Scott's face went white. They continued through all the charges. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Every single count. I sat in the gallery, Lucas beside me, and watched justice finally arrive. It had taken 5 years, months of investigation, weeks of trial. But here it was, undeniable and absolute. Guilty. The word echoed in my mind like a gong. My son's killers were convicted. The law I'd served for 25 years had done what it was meant to do. As the bailiffs led Danielle and Scott out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Danielle turned to look at me one last time. Her face was destroyed, makeup running, eyes red and swollen. I looked back at her without expression. She'd made her choices. Now she'd live with the consequences. Lucas squeezed my hand. "It's over, isn't it, Grandpa?" "Almost," I said. "One more step." Sentencing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Until then, I had one more piece of business to attend to. I had to make sure Lucas would never have to go back to his mother. Sentencing day arrived 3 weeks after the guilty verdicts. The courtroom was packed again. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The judge would decide how long Danielle and Scott would spend behind bars for murdering my son. I arrived early with Lucas. He'd asked to be there, and I'd agreed. He deserved to see justice fully served. We sat in the front row of the gallery, and I could feel the weight of what was about to happen settling over us. The bailiffs brought Danielle and Scott in separately. Both wore prison jumpsuits now, orange for Scott, gray for Danielle. Gone were the courtroom clothes their attorneys had dressed them in during the trial. This was what they were now, convicted murderers. Danielle looked terrible. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her face pale and drawn, dark circles under her eyes. When she saw Lucas and me in the gallery, something crumbled in her expression. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but her attorney put a hand on her arm, stopping her. Scott looked defiant still, his jaw set, refusing to show emotion, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He knew what was coming. The judge, a stern woman named Patricia Reynolds, who I'd worked with during my time on the bench, reviewed the case file. The courtroom was silent except for the rustle of papers. The defendants stand convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and insurance fraud, Judge Reynolds began. The evidence presented at trial showed a calculated, premeditated killing, motivated by financial gain. Christopher Mitchell was deliberately murdered by people he trusted, his wife and a mechanic he'd hired in good faith. Danielle was crying now, silent tears running down her face. Furthermore, the judge continued, the defendants showed no remorse after the crime. They collected insurance money, accepted financial support from the victim's father, and lived comfortably for 5 years while maintaining their lies. When faced with the possibility of losing access to money, they immediately began planning a second murder. Scott shifted in his chair, his attorney whispering urgently to him. This court finds no mitigating circumstances that would justify leniency. The defendants acted with malice, calculation, and complete disregard for human life. Therefore, the court sentences Scott Wells to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Scott's defiant expression finally cracked. His face went white, his hands gripping the table. The court sentences Danielle Mitchell to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after serving 25 years. Danielle collapsed forward, her head hitting the table, sobs racking her body. Her attorney tried to comfort her, but she was beyond comfort now. Additionally, Judge Reynolds said, both defendants are ordered to make restitution. Scott Wells and Danielle Mitchell are jointly liable for repaying $250,000 in fraudulent insurance proceeds to the insurance company and $150,000 to Harley Mitchell for funds obtained under false pretenses. The numbers meant nothing to them now. They'd spend the rest of their lives in prison. But the restitution was symbolic. Everything they'd gained from Chris's death, they'd have to give back. Does either defendant wish to make a statement before being remanded? The judge asked. Danielle's attorney whispered to her. She lifted her head, mascara smeared across her face, and looked at me. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, might show some genuine remorse. Instead, she screamed, "You took everything from me!" Her voice was raw, broken. "You destroyed my life. You couldn't just let it go. You had to ruin everything." The bailiffs moved toward her, but she kept shouting. "You're a monster, Harley. You turned my own son against me. You hunted me down like an animal. This is all your fault." Her attorney was pulling at her arm, trying to get her to stop. The judge was calling for order, but Danielle was beyond control now, all her careful manipulations stripped away, showing the raw selfishness underneath. "I hate you!" she shrieked as the bailiffs grabbed her arms. I stood up slowly, meeting her eyes across the courtroom. My voice was calm, cutting through her hysteria. "I didn't take anything from you, Danielle. I returned what you stole. Justice. That's all this ever was." She struggled against the bailiffs, but they were already leading her toward the door. Her screams echoed through the courthouse hallway as they took her away. Scott said nothing. He just stared straight ahead as they led him out, his defiance finally gone, replaced by the hollow realization that he'd lost everything. When they were gone, the courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Reynolds banged her gavel, restoring order. "This court is adjourned." Lucas and I stood. He looked up at me with those serious eyes. "Is it really over, Grandpa?" "Not quite yet," I said. "One more thing." The next day, I filed a petition in family court to terminate Danielle's parental rights and grant me full custody of Lucas. Given that Danielle had been convicted of murdering Lucas's father, the outcome was never in doubt. The hearing was brief. Danielle's attorney argued from the prison via video conference, making weak claims about maternal bonds and rehabilitation, but the judge, a practical man who'd seen too many cases of child abuse, wasn't swayed. "Ms. Mitchell murdered her son's father for financial gain," he said. "She has demonstrated a complete lack of parental fitness. The petition to terminate parental rights is granted. Full custody of Lucas Mitchell is awarded to his grandfather, Harley Mitchell." Lucas squeezed my hand when the judge's gavel came down. He was officially mine now, not just living with me, but legally, permanently mine to raise. We walked out of the courthouse into bright sunshine. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe properly. "Can we go see Dad?" Lucas asked quietly. I nodded. We drove to the cemetery, stopping to buy white roses on the way. At Chris's grave, we stood together in silence for a long moment. "We did it, son," I said finally. "Your killers are in prison. Lucas is safe. Justice was served." Lucas knelt and placed the roses on the grave. "I miss you, Dad. But Grandpa took care of everything, just like you would have wanted." We stood there a while longer, letting the afternoon sun warm us before heading home. Home felt different now. The house on Pinewood Drive, which had felt heavy and dark during Danielle's presence, was light again. I'd had the place deep cleaned after her arrest, getting rid of everything that reminded me of her betrayal. Her bedroom was now Lucas's study. The spaces she'd occupied were reclaimed. The legal restitution from Danielle and Scott would take years to collect. They had no assets left. But the insurance company had already begun clawing back the $250,000 through their legal team. Whatever money eventually came back, I'd already decided it would go into Lucas's educational trust. I'd set up that trust properly now, funding it with $430,000 from my retirement savings. Combined with whatever restitution we eventually recovered, Lucas would have more than enough for any university he chose. He'd have the future Chris had wanted for him. One evening, about a week after the sentencing, Lucas was doing homework at the kitchen table while I made dinner. Spaghetti with meatballs, Chris's favorite, and Lucas's too. The routine felt normal, comfortable. This was what family was supposed to feel like. "Grandpa?" Lucas said, looking up from his math worksheet. "Yeah, buddy? Are you happy?" I stopped stirring the sauce and thought about that. Was I happy? Chris was still dead. I'd never get him back. The last 5 years had been built on lies and betrayal. I'd had to hunt down and prosecute my own daughter-in-law for murder. "I'm not happy," I said honestly, "but I'm satisfied. Justice was served. You're safe. Your future is secure. That's what matters." Lucas nodded slowly. "I'm glad you figured it out. What Mom did, I mean. I was scared to tell you at first." "You did tell me, when it counted. That took courage. Did you always know that you'd get them?" I thought back to that morning when Lucas had first whispered to me at breakfast, warning me about the casino. Had I known then that it would lead here? "I knew I'd find the truth," I said. What I did with that truth once I found it, that was the harder question. "But you went to the police? You did it the right way?" "I did. Because that's what the law is for, to find justice when people do wrong." I turned back to the stove. Your father believed in that. So do I. So should you. The doorbell rang. Lucas jumped up to answer it, returning with Kevin Brown, the private investigator who'd helped me build the case against Danielle and Scott. Judge Mitchell, Kevin said, shaking my hand. Just wanted to drop off my final report. Everything's documented, filed with the court. The case is officially closed on my end. Thank you, Kevin, for everything. You did most of the work yourself. I just helped connect the dots. He glanced at Lucas. You've got a brave grandson there. His testimony was crucial. After Kevin left, I returned to the chess club for the first time since the trial ended. The Reno Chess Club had been my sanctuary for years, a place where the only battles were on 64 squares, where strategy was a game instead of survival. My regular chess partner, Robert King, was already there, setting up the board. He was 72, a retired accountant who'd been playing chess since he was a kid. Harley, he greeted me with a firm handshake. Read about your case in the papers. That was some detective work. Just used what I learned from the bench, I said, sitting down across from him. The law's there for everyone. You just have to know how to use it. Still, must have taken guts to go after your own daughter-in-law. It took necessity. She killed my son. What else was I going to do? Robert moved his pawn to a 4. I responded with a 5, falling into our familiar rhythm. For an hour we played in comfortable silence, the click of pieces on wood the only sound. Chess was pure. No lies, no betrayal, just logic and strategy. It was exactly what I needed. That evening, back home, I found Lucas in his room reading. He'd become a voracious reader lately, burning through books like Chris used to do. What are you reading? I asked from the doorway. To Kill a Mockingbird. It's for school, but it's actually good. I smiled. It is good. Atticus Finch. He's a lawyer who does the right thing, even when it's hard. Like you did with Mom. Something like that. Though Atticus had more grace about it than I did. You had plenty of grace, Grandpa. You didn't yell or get mean. You just found the truth and let it speak for itself. Smart kid. Too smart sometimes. But that was okay. He'd need to be smart to handle what life had thrown at him. Later, after Lucas had gone to bed, I stood at my study window, looking out at the quiet Reno neighborhood. Streetlights cast long shadows across the lawns. Families were settling in for the night, normal families without murder and betrayal and trials. I'd spent 25 years as a judge, presiding over cases, administering justice, believing the system worked when given the chance. Then my own family became the case, and I had had to use every tool I'd learned to find the truth. Chris was still gone. That hollow place in my chest where my son used to be would never fully heal. But I'd done what needed doing. I'd protected Lucas. I'd made sure Chris's killers paid for what they'd done. I'd used the law the way it was meant to be used, not for revenge, but for justice. There was a difference, subtle but important. Revenge would have been shooting Scott Wells in his auto shop, pushing Danielle down the stairs she'd wanted to push me down. Justice was building the case, presenting the evidence, letting the legal system do what it was designed to do. I heard footsteps behind me. Lucas, in his pajamas, came into the study. Can't sleep? I asked. Just wanted to say goodnight again. He hugged me. I love you, Grandpa. I love you too, Lucas. Do you think Dad would be proud of what we did? I thought about Chris, kind, trusting Chris who'd believed in fairness and doing right. Yeah, I think he'd be proud. We got justice for him. We did it the right way. Lucas nodded and headed back to bed. I stayed at the window a while longer, thinking about how life had changed. 5 months ago, I'd been a retired judge, living a quiet life, supporting my daughter-in-law and grandson, grieving my son but accepting his death as tragic accident. Now I knew the truth. Now the people responsible were in prison. Now Lucas had a future free from his mother's toxic influence. It wasn't happiness, but it was justice. And for a man who'd spent his life believing in the law, that was enough. The weight that had pressed on my chest since Chris's death had lifted. Not completely, but enough that I could breathe freely again. I'd done what I set out to do. My son's killers were behind bars. My grandson was safe and provided for. The truth had come to light. Tomorrow, Lucas and I would wake up and continue building our new normal. I'd make breakfast. He'd do his homework, We'd talk about school and chess and whatever else came up. We'd live our lives the way Chris would have wanted, with integrity, with purpose, with love. That was the real victory. Not Danielle's life sentence or Scott's prison cell, but this. Lucas and I together, moving forward. Justice served, truth revealed, family protected. For a retired judge, that was everything that mattered. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.